In the winter of 2018, a reservoir in northern Iraq began to drop. The Mosul Dam, the country's largest, holds back a vast artificial lake on the Tigris River. For decades, the water had kept everything beneath it hidden. But that year, a severe drought forced authorities to draw down the reservoir to irrigate failing crops. As the waterline fell, something emerged from the lakebed that had not been seen in over 3,000 years. Rising from the mud on the eastern bank of the Tigris were the tops of massive walls, thick, squared, and unmistakable. They were made of sun-dried mud brick, some of them more than 2 meters thick and still standing more than 2 meters tall. They were not natural formations. They were the remains of a palace. A team of German and Kurdish archaeologists mobilized within days. They knew the water could return at any time. What they uncovered in the weeks that followed was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the region in decades. A Bronze Age palace, 3,400 years old, with rooms still partially intact, walls still bearing traces of vivid red and blue paint, and clay tablets covered in cuneiform script pressed into them before the age of Homer, before the founding of Rome, before the construction of Solomon's temple. The palace belonged to an empire that most people have never heard of. One that once rivaled Egypt, battled the Hittites, and controlled a territory stretching from the Mediterranean to the mountains of modern-day Iran. An empire so thoroughly erased from history that its capital city has never been found. Its name was Mitanni, and the story of how it rose, ruled, and vanished is one of the great unsolved puzzles of the ancient world. For most of recorded history, nobody knew the Mitanni existed. Their name does not appear in the Bible. Greek historians never mentioned them. Roman scholars had no record of their civilization. Unlike Egypt, Babylon, or Assyria, the Mitanni left behind almost no texts of their own. No royal chronicles, no monumental inscriptions boasting of conquests, no tomb paintings celebrating their kings. Everything we know about them comes from the records of their neighbors. Egyptian pharaohs wrote about a powerful kingdom called Naharin that controlled the lands east of the Euphrates. Hittite kings documented wars against a state they called Mitanni. Assyrian annals referenced a territory called Hanigalbat that had once dominated the upper Tigris and Kabur river valleys. The same empire described by 3 different civilizations, each using a different name. What emerges from these foreign accounts is the outline of a kingdom that should not have been so easily forgotten. At its height, roughly between 1500 and 1350 BCE, the Mitanni Empire stretched from the city of Aleppo in modern-day Syria to the city of Kirkuk in modern-day Iraq. It controlled the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris. It sat at the crossroads of every major trade route in the ancient Near East. Its warriors, called the Marianu, were among the most feared chariot fighters of the Bronze Age. They developed lighter, faster spoke-wheeled chariots that gave them a decisive military advantage over their rivals. The world's oldest known horse training manual was written by a Mitanni horseman named Kikuli. The Mitanni were powerful enough to force Egypt to the negotiating table. After decades of conflict over control of Syria, the 2 empires struck a peace deal. Mitanni princesses were sent to marry Egyptian pharaohs. Diplomatic letters between the courts, preserved in the famous Amarna archive in Egypt, reveal a relationship between equals, with Mitanni kings addressing the pharaoh as brother. This was not a minor regional power. This was one of the great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, a member of what historians call the Great Powers Club, alongside Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, and Assyria. And yet, within a few generations, it was gone. The collapse began with a succession crisis. Around 1350 BCE, a Mitanni king named Tushratta found himself caught between two rising powers. The Hittite Empire to the west was expanding aggressively. The Assyrian Empire to the east was reasserting its independence after years as a Mitanni vassal. When a rival claimant to the Mitanni throne sought backing from the Hittites, Egypt, which had been Tushratta's most important ally, withdrew its support. The reasons are not entirely clear, but the effect was immediate. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I crossed the Euphrates with his army and marched on the Mitanni capital, a city called Washukani. What happened next ended the empire. Suppiluliuma sacked Washukani. Tushratta either fled or was assassinated by his own son. The Hittites installed a puppet king. The Assyrians, sensing weakness, carved away the eastern territories. What had been a single unified empire splintered into fragments, fought over by the Hittites and the Assyrians in a war that dragged on for decades. By the time the dust settled, the Mitanni no longer existed as an independent state. Their lands were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. Their language, Hurrian, gradually fell out of use. Their cities were renamed, rebuilt, or abandoned. Within a few centuries, even their name had disappeared from the written record. And here is the detail that haunts archaeologists to this day. The capital city, Washukani, the political and administrative heart of the empire, has never been located. Texts mention it repeatedly. Armies marched toward it. Treaties were signed there. Kings were crowned and murdered within its walls. But no one has ever found it. Its ruins, if they survive, remain buried somewhere in the upper Kabur River valley of modern-day Syria, likely beneath an unexcavated mound that has never been properly surveyed. An entire imperial capital, lost. This is the context that makes the discovery at Kemune so extraordinary. When the palace emerged from the Mosul reservoir in 2018, archaeologists recognized it immediately as a Mitanni structure. The mud brick construction, the wall thickness, the traces of painted murals in red and blue, all matched the extremely rare examples of Mitanni architecture found at only 2 other sites in the entire region. The team, led by researchers from the universities of Tübingen and Freiburg in Germany, working alongside the Kurdistan Archaeology Organization, had only weeks before the water might return. They partially excavated 8 rooms inside the palace. They found large fired bricks used as floor slabs. They found plastered walls, and they found 10 clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system used across ancient Mesopotamia. One of those tablets suggested something remarkable. The site at Kemune was likely the ancient city of Zakiku, a settlement mentioned in Near Eastern sources as far back as 1800 BCE. If the identification is correct, the city had existed for at least 400 years before the palace was built, making it one of the longest occupied sites in the Mitanni world. Then the water rose, and the palace vanished again beneath the reservoir. 3 years passed. Then, In late 2021, another drought hit Iraq, worse than the first. Water levels in the Mosul reservoir dropped dramatically as authorities again drew down the lake to save the country's crops. The palace resurfaced. This time, the archaeologists were ready. A joint team assembled within days and began an emergency excavation in January 2022. They worked through the winter, racing the water, unsure how long the window would last. What they found was far more than a palace. Kemune was an entire city. They documented a massive fortification system with walls and towers, a monumental multi-story storage building likely used to hold goods from across the region, an industrial complex. The settlement was larger and more organized than anyone had expected. This was not a minor outpost. It was a significant urban center, a city that had played a real role in the administration and economy of the Mitanni Empire. And then there were the tablets. More than 100 cuneiform clay tablets were recovered, many of them dating not from the Mitanni period, but from the Middle Assyrian period, roughly 1365 BCE. This placed them at the exact moment of transition, when Mitanni rule was collapsing and the Assyrians were taking over. The tablets may contain records of how one empire replaced another, administrative documents chronicling the handover of power in real time. One researcher described the survival of these tablets as close to a miracle. They were made of unfired clay. They had spent decades submerged in reservoir water. By all logic, they should have dissolved. But they were found largely intact, preserved by the very earthquake that had destroyed the city. Around 1350 BCE, a massive earthquake had toppled the upper walls of the buildings, burying the tablets under meters of collapsed mud brick before the elements could reach them. The catastrophe that ended the city also sealed its records. As the water began to rise again in February 2022, the team worked faster. Some of their trenches began flooding before they could finish. In a final effort, they covered the exposed ruins with tight-fitting plastic sheeting and buried them under layers of gravel, hoping to protect the unfired mud brick walls from further erosion. Then, the reservoir swallowed the city again. Kemune is now fully submerged. The archaeologists do not know when it will reappear. It could emerge during the next severe drought, or it could remain underwater for years. The site is entirely at the mercy of rainfall, water policy, and climate. The tablets recovered in 2022 are now being translated. Researchers hope they will provide new information about the internal structure of the Mitanni Empire, its economic systems, and the process by which Assyria replaced it. But the full excavation of Kemune, the mapping of its streets, the exploration of its buildings, the recovery of whatever else lies buried there, can only happen when the water allows it. This is the paradox at the heart of the discovery. The same drought that is devastating Iraqi agriculture and threatening the livelihoods of millions is also the only force capable of revealing what lies beneath the reservoir. Every time the water drops, a window opens into the Bronze Age. Every time the rains return, it closes. The Mitanni Empire lasted roughly 250 years. It controlled one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. It traded with Egypt, fought the Hittites, and developed military technology that changed the ancient world. Its princesses married pharaohs. Its horsemen wrote the first training manuals. Its cities lined the banks of the rivers that gave birth to civilization itself. And then it was erased. Not by a natural disaster, but by the empires that came after it. The Assyrians, who absorbed its territory, had no interest in preserving its memory. The Hittites, who triggered its collapse, recorded only enough to justify their conquest. Egypt, which had once called its king brother, moved on to other alliances. Within a few generations, the Mitanni had been written out of history by the very civilizations that had once feared them. What remains is buried, some of it under unexcavated mounds in the Syrian desert, some of it under the waters of an Iraqi reservoir, and some of it, perhaps including the lost capital itself, underground, that has never been surveyed, in a region too unstable for sustained archaeological work. The palace at Kemune surfaced twice in 4 years, each time for only a few weeks, each time yielding discoveries that reshaped what we know about one of the ancient world's most powerful and least understood empires. The next time it appears, if it appears, archaeologists will be ready. But the Tigris, the drought, and the politics of water will decide when that moment comes. 3,400 years after its walls were painted red and blue, the palace waits beneath the water, patient, preserved, and entirely beyond our control. Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of story you want to follow, subscribe. There is more to come.